Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. If you're a fan of poetry, you know it can take many forms. Spoken word poetry is a type of performance art that involves reading poetry on stage in front of a live audience, where the poet uses their voice, movements, and intonations to bring the poem to life. The poems often address issues of social justice, politics, race, and community. Roya Marsh is a master of spoken word poetry and has performed and competed in poetry slams in 23 states. Now retired from competition, she organizes poetry slams and open mics and teaches poetry and creative writing to students across the city. In her new book, Savings Time, she writes about coming of age as a Black woman and a lesbian in the Bronx and about the challenges of surviving in America when one is Black and queer. While her poems are loud and often filled with indignation, Marsh calls them a love letter to my queerness. Welcome. As I said, you say your poems are kind of love letter, but they don't read like your typical, love letter poems that we're used to hearing. There's a lot of outrage towards those who you say would rather that Black queer girls were dead. Who are they? Who are the they that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think they is a system. I also believe they are, in every sense, the opposition. Sometimes they can be a school of thought that believe that a certain person who identifies in a certain way deserves to be erased or nullified. Sometimes they can be within our own households, having parents who don't believe that we have the right as children to identify how we rightly feel our bodies and our mental and every aspect of ourselves is telling us that we actually are. I also think so much about the writing as an art form being a love letter itself to those who are living with these sorts of thoughts that plague their mind, that plague their everyday lives, the feelings of unworthiness, the feelings of doubt, the feelings of loneliness and loss, right? To say to someone that you are not alone in feeling this way, and you are not alone in knowing that you are worthy and doing the work to figure out how we can help others no longer feel this way.
What was it like growing up Black and female and queer in the Bronx?
Yeah, I have a very exciting bag of memories of my upbringing, most specifically because there was no one in my family who identified as queer, gay, lesbian, any of those titles outwardly. So a lot of the learning that I wanted to do about who I was to be in the world in reference to that aspect of my identity, I was getting from media, from film, from movies, and also learning from a patriarchal standpoint, following after my older brothers, right, who were definitely idols to me when I was a child in terms of their interest in fashion, their interest in music, their interest in sports. So I loved to play basketball. I loved to run track and get dirty. And, when I got old enough to go out and ride my bike, I was hanging out with a bunch of the neighborhood boys and just riding my bike down all types of wild hills and having these experiences that I think were truly formative in terms of who I was going to be as a person and how adventurous I was going to be and how outspoken and how I was going to be able to run with a crowd, right? I was going to be able to hold my own amidst people who were supposed to be stronger than me based on everything that society was telling me, as well as what the media would tell me and what some literature would also tell us about the gender binary, right? And thinking to myself, my future could be a basketball player. My future could be a teacher. There were educators in my family. My future could be a nurse. My mom's a nurse, and I think so much about how when I was younger, I had all of these vast dreams of all the things that I wanted to be, to grow up, to become an educator, to become a public speaker, a poet, a writer. These are things that actually seem unfathomable to me from my beginnings, which I wouldn't say were meager. I would say was definitely, Bronx 90s. If you have an image in your mind of what the 90s were like in the Bronx, New York, what the early 2000s were like in the Bronx, New York, what it was like growing up in the Bronx, New York, and then having the internet take hold of your household, and then having social media come into play, where people were then connecting with strangers. It was just such a wild experience that I believe was very necessary in order to inform the outlook that I have at this age.
It sounds like you got a lot of positivity from your brothers, from the guys in the neighborhood, from your mom, but perhaps not so much from your father. And did you suffer any kind of bullying from people who thought you were queer?
Yeah, I think in my personal life, I wouldn't identify what happened to me as bullying in terms of the outward world, but I know how other people could see it that way. I do believe that before I had language to describe who I am as a person, so many people were willing to tell me who I am and what I was good for and what I was worth. And there came a point where I grew comfortable with allowing people to have those sorts of thoughts on their own, knowing that that actually doesn't make or break me. It doesn't determine or dictate who I actually get to be. I'm the only person who is in charge of that. And I say that to say a lot of the writing that I do within my poetry are about experiences that I've had in my personal life with my brothers, with those friends, with my father, who are all multifaceted people and all are susceptible to the ways of the world just as I am. And there are so many things in the media, especially growing up in the time where I grew up, that would tell a person that anyone who is operating in the way that seems to go against the grain or that is abnormal is wrong, is an abomination, is a sin. And all of the other language that people have come to use to describe people who are just being their very selves. For me, it's really important to recognize that these people are humans and they're in the world and they have their own misjudgments and their own feelings around how unsafe it might be for a person to live their life as their actual self. And so what manifests as anger, what manifests as bigotry could, in some instances, be anxiety, could be a father's fear that their daughter might not have the easy life that they depict for them, could be a father's notion that a woman needs to marry a man and be cared for in that way and, birth children and build a legacy in that way, because that's the thing that maybe he feels saved him, that he feels kept him whole. But it doesn't let loose the hold on an individual who is also a living being and has the right to live their life in the way that they should. And yeah.
When I was growing up, there was a certain acknowledgement in the Black community that there were gay Black males. Mm-hmm. I mean, because you knew the church choir director was gay. You knew half the men in the choir were gay. Mm-hmm. I mean, some of the teachers, you knew that. And while it wasn't necessarily approved of, it was accepted. But gay females seemed to be, and I'm sure they were there, but they were kind of invisible. Did you experience that, and do you think that that is true now?
Yeah, I think that, I don't necessarily know that we're invisible, but I do know that based on this being a patriarchal society, that there is a hyper focus on the male identity being masculine and being violent, be a man, be tough, even some of the language that we use when we want people to do well, we say, kill it out there, So all of these notions are tethered together with the idea that if a man breaks away from any of that, that's the ultimate curse. I think in my experience, the erasure of even Black lesbians, Black women lesbians, the silence around it, the secrecy, the having the friend, for 40 years who lives in the back room, speaks to the overall erasure of women as a people, most specifically because you know, when we think about queer relationships, we think about the language of friend. You know, women themselves will call some of their best friends their girlfriends. But I, as a person who someone would deem masculine presenting, would say, I'm hanging out with my girlfriend, and they're immediately assuming that I'm speaking about a romantic relationship, right? So then there's a bit of a shift in that way. And I think what brought us out of the shadows, what sort of does the work against that invisibility to bring us into the visible light, are stories around media, around, you know, what films that these artists are implemented in, which I would even say in my own life, I never got to see in film growing up a positive lesbian or masculine presenting character in that way. I saw Queen Latifah robbing a bank and set it off. You know, I saw some caricatures and jokes from In Living Color. I saw all, you know, different types of jokes made around these identities, to where now in 2025, we can see Lena Waithe, we can see Leslie Jones, we can see a number of women in the WNBA, a number of women in film and media making room for them. Queen Latifah herself making room for artists to come into the light and to be exactly who they are as women, and not succumb to what the media and what the general public will say is the way that we need to put ourselves forward.
And you wrote a poem about societies, about women who don't fit society's notion of femininity and attractiveness and how women ought to be.
This one for the bad bitches that rarely get called on. The big foreheads, big heads, little heads, cock-eyed, eyeglasses, unibrow, gap-tooth smiles, stubborn hairs above the lip, below the lip, extra peach fuzz, with the saggy breasts, little extra around the middle, round the side, big back, lot of extra all over, semi-tight jeans, belly hanging over, Lil Miss Muffin, flat booty, itty-bitty-yitty committee, bag of bones, nice toes, hammer toes, big feet, little ones, daddy issues, mommy issues, issues. You are worthy right now. Go where there is love. Your flowers are waiting.
When and how did you realize that you were queer?
I think at a very early age, I recognized some attractions, not sexual attractions in any way, but definitely who I was geared towards liking romantically when those feelings started to come about, which were very different from who my age mates, who were young women, were interested in. I know that my interest, even in terms of extracurricular activities, differentiated from my younger female peers at the time based on what my interests were and what their interests were, and who was partaking in these interests, right? Who was really into sports. By the time that I was in 5th grade, I can actively remember conversations around who likes who and who's dating who and who has a crush on who going around. And I knew that none of my crushes were any of the boys. And that wasn't strange or foreign to me at the time, but it was also very new. It wasn't something that I had had healthy experiences with or visual experiences with in general at the time.
I saw a movie some years ago called Pariah. It's a British film about queer girls growing up in England, and this one particular girl trying to find her community. And what impressed me was that the young lesbian community was very harsh. I guess it was very skeptical of who she was and whether she really wanted to join them. And it just seemed like there were some pretty brutal hazing rites that were required in order to be accepted. Is that the way it is, or?
Nah, I don't think that that's the way it is. I don't want to invalidate anyone else's experience, but, you know, I know that that wasn't my experience. You know, as I mentioned earlier, there were so many instances where people were calling me a lesbian or calling me some sort of name when I didn't even really have a definition of what those words meant for myself. And so growing into that language and that understanding, there are so many titles that exist out there to describe a person. And I think I align myself with queerness because it's a real word. It's a word that exists in the dictionary. It is a word that is describing any individual, as opposed to me having to tether myself to one title that says I just like one thing, or I have to be this way, or I need to operate under this umbrella. I think so much about, even coming out stories, which I don't have one. One day I got myself together and I brought someone home and I said, this is my person. And everyone was like, all right, whatever. So there was so much weight that I was putting on it for myself, right? Because of the shame that I had internalized, to get to the point where now, folks' greatest struggle is remembering who this partner's name is, and not to say the previous partner's name or things like that, right? Or to, try to get to know a new person or get to connect with a new person, as opposed to trying to other us or making us feel that we don't belong in these spaces,
How did you get to poetry?
How did I get to I got to poetry on a date. I thought I was at an open mic. It turned out it was a poetry slam. I had no concept of what a poetry slam was. The host at the time, Nathan Pearson, he described to me what the poetry slam was, what the rules are, how many poems I needed. I went on to win that night, but that was really an introduction to the performance aspect of it. I had been writing since I was a child. I've always had journals. I always wrote what I believe were raps and rhymes, and then when I got older, I started to see them gravitate towards the poetry that aligned more with what was going on in my outer world, and not just what was going on in my personal world. And at this point, I've stayed in this genre for so long because I found the freedom to tell my truth, to tell a truth that could liberate another person, to tell a truth that could broaden someone's horizons, that could open someone's perspective to seeing the world through someone else's eyes and being more empathetic to the people that they rub shoulders with day in and day out, and hoping that that could promote some kindness.
QTNA. How do we know who God is actually speaking to? Is he speaking to racists, or the shop owner that follows black customers around? The father and son who pile into the pickup to hunt for a neighborhood jogger? Is he speaking to the pastor who buys luxury homes and cars while the congregation tithes for mercy? Or to the platform preacher condemning the queer less than woman on her way to work to hell? Or the father threatening to disown his firstborn? Is he speaking to the mother who straps her toddlers in a van and plows it into a body of water? Is he speaking to the bombers before they strap destruction to their chests, or the officer before he pulls the trigger? Is he speaking to the drunk driver going 100 miles per hour on a busy Texas freeway, or the silent whispers from the barrel of a gun into the ear of a person at the end of their rope? Is he speaking to the poor, the houseless, the loveless? Does he say, stay that way? You can handle this battle. Don't give up. Is he speaking to his toughest soldiers on their deathbeds? Does he simply say, you had a good run, my child, and close the curtains? Is his voice deep? Is it loud? Does he know what that book says about him, about me? Does he believe it? Does he evolve? Is he passionate about anything other than his own will? Is he speaking to anyone who will listen? Is he even speaking?
You organize poetry slams and you teach poetry and creative writing. What are you hearing from these young writers?
Yeah, the young writers, honestly, I find so much joy in working with them and collaborating with them because they actually keep my candle burning. I'm hearing that they are experiencing some of the same things that I'm experiencing in my 30s, but at such a greater rate and with sometimes much less tools and much less know-how to navigate these experiences. They talk about politics, personal politics, gender politics. They talk about their experiences in their home life. You know, when I think about writing about my own experiences, I'm doing retrospective work. I'm doing introspective work. Sometimes when I encounter young people and they're writing about their experience, they finish writing their poem, they hand it in, and they have to go home to the experience they were just writing about. So where is the room and where is the space for them to process that, you know? So what I hear from them overall is that they see these things. They have a level of awareness, and sometimes the poetry is the best space where they can say that freely without shame and without judgment. And to someone who is willing to read between the lines, to someone who is willing to break down these metaphors and see that sometimes there really is an issue that is internal, and they really just need another person to see them and to help them feel seen and heard in order to move past it. And sometimes the issue is extremely external, and they need someone to read this poem and pass it on to the guidance counselor or pass it on to the principal and bring in someone else who can be a real resource for this young person who is suffering through something that is manifesting in this piece of art.
We have a political climate that is hostile to people who identify differently in terms of gender. So what do you think is ahead? I mean, what do you see ahead with this administration and with where the country seems to be politically for people who are queer?
Yeah, you know, I think community action is highly important. I hope that there's so much more of that ahead. I know that there are actually institutions right now that are helping people change their gender markers on their IDs, and that are helping people even from last year and 2 years ahead, you know, get their marriage licenses and things like that that they feel may come into question, or which are already coming into question. But I think that collective action, I think that love, are the things that have been behind us, are the things that have propelled us forward, and are the things that will continue to be ahead of folks who have identities that live within the that live without on the outside of the margins, to be in a space where we know that there is no one person and there is no one system that can actually nullify our existence. And the more that starts to happen, the more of us who are awakened will be on our way, and will be studying and reading and learning and coming together to make sure that we survive.
And not just woke, but awakened.
Yes.
As you said. I've never been to a poetry slam. What's it like being on the slam circuit?
You know, it's a gas. I haven't been on the slam circuit since 2017, so I know that there have definitely been some changes. It's funny because on the slam circuit, the word community is thrown around in a lot of ways. The slam community, but you get to see a lot of competition, which actually isn't rooted in community. It's rooted in, you know, who wants to be the best of the best. And something that I realized personally was that I actually didn't want to be the best, but also to be the best, I couldn't have been playing around with anyone who I didn't believe to be the best. And so, you know, there is some camaraderie around people who believe in themselves and who are confident in their ability to tell their stories. But, you know, there's also drama because it's humans. There are adults who are coming from all different walks of lives and all different socioeconomic statuses into one place to tell stories about their lives, their upbringings, and their perspectives. And so you have to imagine coming together from all over the country, sometimes all over the world, that there are going to be some clashes. And, you know, I thought so much about what my intentions were in writing and in beginning to share my poetry, and it never was to compete. That was never it for me. And so the reason, why I had to distance myself from that was for me to actually see what I was doing to myself to be elevated, to be successful in that field, which isn't something that I would be doing to myself had I not been competing against people. Had I been centering community, I could have been Oprah by now,
I have a friend who he was a colleague of mine on a newspaper, and I found out that he also does, slam poetry.
Yes.
And that at one of the journalist convention, there was actually a competition, and he won it, and he
Yes.
won something like $2,000. I said, wow,
Yeah.
there's some money in it.
Yeah, every once and again, a colleague of mine, she's about to put on a slam in Harlem, and they have, I believe, $1,000 pot. I know the Nuyorican Poets Cafe just had their grand slam, and they had $1,000 pot. And that's also something that's fairly new in terms of the local or regional slams, having those kinds of pots, because overall, especially if you travel with a team and the winning prize is $1,000 and there's 5 of you, you're not even getting back what you put in to get there. But if you show up at a convention, right, and
Right.
you have experience here, then you can very well come off with some money. Always notoriety, people love that. People love the bragging rights. I think what I loved was watching the lyrical acrobatics, watching people tell stories of great pain or people telling stories of great triumph in some of the most beautifully artistic ways that I've ever seen, in a way that made me want to become those poems, that made me want to love language in that way and talk about my experiences in that way. And so those are some of the greatest takeaways that I have from those spaces, because there are some extremely brilliant writers, and I wish that they could all have an experience on one-to-one to share their art form, but more so talk about the person who exists behind those poems and within those poems. And operating in that space, there isn't enough emphasis on that. There's so much emphasis on the poem and the competition and potentially a prize, and not necessarily why we're in this room telling these kinds of stories.
Well, your book, Savings Time, arrived on my desk months and months ago, and I sort of ignored it. And then, one day I picked it up and started reading, and I'm glad I did. And I'm glad you came here today to talk to us about your experience and about your work.
Yes, I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank Roya Marsh, author of Savings Time, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming show, you can follow us on Instagram at One-to-One CUNY TV, and you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For the City University of New York and One-to-One, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.